You're listening to the Rethreading Madness podcast, which airs live on Vancouver Co-op Radio, CFRO 100.5 FM. We are recorded and produced on the unceded traditional territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh nations around Vancouver, BC. I'm your host, Bernadine Fox, and this is the show that dares to change how we think about mental health. Welcome to our show.
I've never been further from knowing what the hell I'm gonna do when I can't seem to find my way under or over or through. Just when I'm ready to give up the fight, there you are when we turn out the lights, and it's alright, it's alright.
Hi, everybody. I have an interesting guest on today by the name of Kagan Goh, who, if you live in and around Vancouver and you know anything about bipolar and art, you know Kagan. It is my pleasure to talk with him and get his perspective on bipolar and to talk to him about his recent works in film, writing, and plays. I'm Bernadine Fox, and today I have the pleasure of speaking again with Kagan Goh, who has been on our show before, but is here for another really important reason and announcement. Kagan is a producer, spoken word artist, playwright, actor, and an award-winning documentary filmmaker who is originally from Singapore, but now lives here in Vancouver and also lives with bipolar. Hi, Kagan.
Hi, nice to meet you again online.
Yes, absolutely. I think if I'm right, you were one of the last shows I did in the studio before COVID hit us, and we've all been back home. I believe that that's correct. So not the last, but certainly one of the last. How have you been doing through all this COVID crap?
Well, it's been a challenging period. I was off work for a year dealing with a physical injury as well as a psychological injury, a workplace injury. So I was undergoing physiotherapy and trauma counseling for the workplace injury, and have been back at work at my new job at the Kettle Friendship Society, Kettle on Boulevard, which is a 140 resident building, known as the best social housing in Vancouver.
Cool.
Kind of like the Shangri-La of social housing, as they call it.
And do you know people who live there?
It serves people with mental health challenges, addictions, at risk of poverty, homelessness, and street youth.
Right. So you live with bipolar. No, actually, I want to go back a little bit because you talked about having a physical injury and a psychological injury. And it was actually interesting to hear that because so often when we hear of people going off work, they don't talk about a mental health injury, but in fact, many people leave work I'm not saying that's as you, but they leave work with depression, and it's not considered an injury from work. But there are a lot of things that happen at work that actually can cause and instigate and solidify depression in people. And it should be considered a workplace injury, but it's not. And so thank you for putting it in that perspective. I appreciate that. So I want to talk about bipolar a little bit because it is a part of all the things that we're going to announce later on for you. And I just want to make sure our audience knows what bipolar is, not just from the psychiatric definition or the DSM-5. I don't think they have a 6 yet, but just so we know, I mean, that's the psychiatric people would call it a brain disorder, which I don't like that word, that causes changes in a person's mood or energy and ability to function, and that you can experience intense emotional states that typically occur in distinct periods of days or weeks. So, and basically because it's bipolar, it is the going back and forth from a manic state to a depressive state. So overwhelming joy, excitement, happiness, lots of energy, down to being very depressed in terms of, sleeping and being down and feeling terrible, basically. So going from very happy to very terrible. That's kind of how they put it. Um, how would you describe it?
Well, I actually prefer the archaic term, which is no longer used as frequently, manic depression,
Hmm.
because it more accurately describes my own personal lived experience of what I call not a disorder or mental illness, but as a condition,
Right,
as being part of the human condition.
right.
Um, yeah, I agree that there are high levels of energy and euphoria and bliss, akin to almost being addicted to any kind of drug or substance, whether it be DMT, LSD, cocaine, crystal meth,
Hmm.
the high that you would experience in any drug, except that it's naturally induced
Right,
from so-called a chemical imbalance in our brains or whatever.
right.
But I experience what they call bipolar 1, which is not just mania, but it tips into psychosis and then depression. So
Hmm.
you talk about psychosis as being a loss of touch of reality,
Right.
hallucinating, seeing auditory and visual hallucinations. I would prefer to call it dreaming of one's eyes open, almost
Mm,
akin to lucid dreaming,
right.
where the visions and hallucinations that I see are almost like dream symbolism, except that I can interpret it. Somebody from the outside looking in would think that my behavior is strange and bizarre, and
Hmm.
irrational.
Right.
But there is, just as there's dream logic that makes sense to the dreamer, there's crazy wisdom that makes sense to the person experiencing the episode.
Absolutely. And the same is true with trauma survivors. We look at trauma survivors, say, cutting and think they're self-harming. And really, in lots of cases, what they're doing is trying to keep themselves okay.
Mhm.
And so, people from the outside can't really always understand what's happening for folks on the inside. So when you say that there's logic, say in I don't even want to call it a paranoid episode, um, or hallucination. I guess you're saying that when you're having a hallucination, whether it's visual or auditory, that actually has logic that is attached to what the rest of us would call reality. Am I getting that correct, or did I misunderstand?
No, you got it correct. It's kind of like dream logic. Like, just as somebody can interpret one's dreams, I myself, in my writing, in my films, in my plays, in my books, and in my art, interpret those so-called, what I prefer to call, instead of hallucinations, visionary experiences. I'm able to understand it. And the difference, I think, where my work differs from a lot of my contemporaries is I make I give the reader or the viewer of my films an intimate insight into an insider's experience of madness,
Mhm.
so that they can understand what's going on within the person. Like in my film that I just released, that just had its world premiere and is currently being screened, uh, to be streamed online for free at the Mental Filmness Film Festival.
Mhm. That's the day my no.
The Day My Cat Saved My Life.
Okay, yes, and we're gonna talk about that in a bit, and I want everybody to go there and take a look at it because it sounds fascinating. Um, so
But for example, in that film, it depicts a true life experience that happened to me, where I was experiencing a psychotic episode and hearing voices and hallucinating, and I used the visual metaphors of film,
mhm,
editing and montage to depict those inner states in a way that other people can understand and relate to and experience. And essentially, the psychotic episode leads me to the brink of suicide,
Mm.
in which my cat literally, figuratively, and metaphorically comes to save my life.
Wow, that's pretty cool. So when you're making films to sort of create a narrative that is true to your experience and not necessarily what we read in dry nonfiction academic books about what is bipolar,
Mm.
do you find yourself handicapped by the film narrative, the common visual language that we have out there that sort of gives us an idea of what's happening? Did you have to come up with new metaphors or new ways of creating visual language to identify that to your
Well, I
audience?
I actually think film is one of the most versatile mediums to depict non-ordinary states of neurodiverse consciousness.
Hmm.
Um, for example, you can show a hallucination visually, you can show visions, you can
Right.
show auditory hallucinations, there are ways of depicting that which are even sometimes even more effective than the written word, or
Right.
spoken word.
Yeah, I tend to think that that's probably true as I'm sitting here with my animation film background and realizing that, yeah, that is true because I'm rambling through writing and visual art and even music. You really do need to have images and sound and a narrative that goes along with film to create some of those things.
Mhm.
Yes. Do you know what causes bipolar? Have they told you what may have been the root of yours?
Uh, I think it's partially triggered by a traumatic incident
Hmm.
that happened to me in my early 20s. I was arrested by 8 cops for supposedly creating a disturbance in a church.
Hmm.
I write about it in my memoir, which has just been published by Caitlin Press.
Is
Called
that the
it's called
survival chart?
Surviving Samsara, and
Right.
the book opens with basically I was consorting and hanging out with a lot of homeless people and street youth in when I was young, and some street youth told me about being evicted from a rooming house called Street Kids in Distress. The acronym stands for SKIDS.
Hmm.
For some bogus housing bylaw that rich land developers wanted to appropriate the prime downtown property to build condominiums.
Right.
And it was Valentine's Day in 1993 when I was diagnosed, when when they came to collect money from the donation tray. I donated a stale loaf of bread with the reasoning in my crazy logic or my crazy wisdom logic that it symbolizes the body of Christ, bread being the body of Christ. And their suspicions were aroused. And later on, the female preacher said, after my sermon, if anybody wants to come up and talk, you're
Mhm.
welcome to do so. And I did have something to say. I said I wanted to advocate for these street youth that had been evicted, and I was going to tell the congregation, since they were having a banquet of free food after the sermon, to bring some of that food to these street youth and talk to them and find out what's happening in their life and advocate for them
Right. Sounds
and
reasonable.
talk to their local MLA, their local MP, because these respectable upper middle class citizens in a congregation have more clout than these street kids would. And I said, these kids are our kids. These kids are the next generation, and we should look after them. We should be our brother's keeper. I wanted to say that, but before I got the chance, I was sequestered down into the basement by two of the church altar boys, and they were questioning me, what do you want to say to them? And I said, that's for me to share with the whole congregation, not just with you. So I walked out of the basement and 8 cops jumped me
Oh,
uh,
my.
and strangle held me and did a choke around my neck. I couldn't breathe, and they sprayed mace in my eyes. And I was struggling, and I realized if I continued to struggle, they were going to kill me.
Yes.
So I went limp and they let me go, and I spent the night in jail. And
So let me just get this straight again. You went into a church and offered bread, which the church says is the body of Christ,
that,
and they
that's
considered
that's
that
my reason. That was my reasoning, but they didn't understand they thought it's just a stale loaf of bread. People usually give money. Why would you give a loaf of bread?
right. I mean, I get it, and I get what, and it sort of goes back to what you were talking about, how you have this logic that goes along with what you're doing, but then you wanted to get up and talk, and instead you were tackled and taken downstairs and then tackled by police, and feared for your life, and this happened in a church where you were trying to advocate on the behalf of people who were hungry.
Well, I think the problem was that we looked the part. I was dressed like a street youth myself. I looked like a homeless person. I had tie-dye pants and tie-dye shirt, patch quilt pants, and torn off jeans. I looked like a street youth, and in the police report decided that I was a drunk native Indian who was on drugs,
Right.
and that I had assaulted the police officers.
Oh, they always say that just to, say that it was okay to hit you or strangle you or
Yeah.
put you to the ground. They always say, well, he assaulted us first. So it's so common. But it goes to the very conversation that we're having these days about racism. And at least in Vancouver, we're really there's a push to really adopt an anti-racist perspective. And you were treated based on how you looked and what you were wearing, and not what you were doing, because clearly in a church you should be able to advocate for people who are hungry. I'm Bernadine Fox, sitting down virtually, of course, with Kagan Goh, who is a multi-talented artist, from spoken word to filmmaker, and lives with bipolar. Again, we were talking about some of your experience. How else do you feel that bipolar sort of is in your life? What do you live with? How would you define bipolar for you?
Well, bipolar, I see it as I I I know it's oftentimes talked about and considered a mental illness or a brain disorder or a mood disorder.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not discounting that it is a sickness or an illness, but I prefer to use the word condition
Mm-hmm. Yes.
because there's so much negative connotations behind those terms. And I'm not trying to be a Pollyanna and just see through rose-colored tinted glasses. But whenever we hear about mental illness, we think of stigma, discrimination, prejudice. We think of people being violent, people being in straitjackets, people being ranting and raving on the streets, being homeless,
Mm-hmm.
and all that is part of the equation. But there's another side to mental illness where so many people are actually holding down jobs. I work, I've got a permanent part-time job.
Mm-hmm.
People are working, people are in marriages and relationships
Mm-hmm.
and are contributing members of society. And basically, some of the gifts of madness that I talk about aren't just, illness, but also they talk about violence and stuff like that. They don't talk about the yin yang duality of
Right.
everything. The positive things of mental illness is heightened creativity. uh, Oftentimes people with mental illness are very spiritual and very compassionate because they've suffered a lot.
Right.
and have compassion for others who have suffered. Their sense of empathy is very heightened and developed. So there are positive aspects to every negative. I like to quote Lauryn Hill, take a negative and turn it into a positive picture.
Yes. Yeah, I've actually said that if I was a person who had to hire staff, I would be inclined to hire people who had dissociative identities because their ability to focus and remove whatever is troubling them from whatever they're doing is so absolutely complete and high that you actually get better workers because they are able to compartmentalize in a way that many people can't. And so they're often really incredible workers in a job situation. So we have so many ideas about what mental health is, and we end up in our society with so many sort of stereotyped ideas in the same way that we've been talking about how First Nations people have been stereotyped, as the drunken Indian or the person that's on drugs, or somebody who steals things, or all those things. Mental health consumers also deal with stereotypes. Can I ask you sort of kind of how what kind of things that you might have dealt with, like have you been has anybody said things like everybody has mood swings sometimes, so, or everyone is a little bipolar sometimes. Do you get those kinds of things where they're minimizing what you are dealing with or stereotyping you?
Well, I mean, I've heard the whole gamut of all sorts of positive and negative things. People either whitewashing it or people minimizing it.
Right.
I mean, the probably I can't think of any at the moment, but for example, my next film, I just got a $25,000 BC Arts Council grant
Mm-hmm.
to make my next film, which is called Common Law. And basically, that story is about how when I was diagnosed with manic depression, I was applying for disability benefits for the very first time through
Right.
social assistance at the welfare office. And they found out that I was in a common law relationship with my girlfriend for 3 years. And he said, she's your spouse, she can support you. You're not eligible for disability. And that was instrumental to the breakup of a 3-year-long relationship.
Wow.
So people with mental illnesses are oftentimes relegated to being single and alone
Yes.
because they're dependents on other people and people don't want to support the individual. My girlfriend's reaction when I told her that I was not eligible for disability or welfare is, I don't want to support an invalid for the rest of my life.
Right.
And then she broke up with me.
Right. And I have heard that that same kind of thing happens when people want to move in together, that they will lose their PWD
Hmm.
status or income, pension, whatever they call it, from social services. I'm not even sure it is social services. I know it's run through social services, but it is called Persons with Disabilities
Yeah.
Pension, because they are moving in with someone. And so it really kind of leaves you in a position where you're relegated to the person, to being a burden.
Yeah, to being a burden. Um, Basically, what I'm hoping to do with this film, it wasn't my intention, but I'm piggybacking this film that uses dark humor. It's not all
Mm,
just doom and gloom and depressing story,
mhm,
but through a dark humorous story to tell the relationship between me and my girlfriend
mhm,
and this welfare worker named Mike, who
mhm.
hates people but loves his dog. That's his
Yeah.
saving grace.
Yes.
And essentially, I'm going to piggyback this project with the campaign to advocate for common law relationships to be allowed and not be penalized financially in terms of taking away a person's PWD or benefits.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a very different thing than being on social assistance and being capable of working and just needing a stopgap, while you're looking for work. You are a person with a disability that is determined to not be able to work. So it's a very different thing. Have you talked with other people who are bipolar, and um, have they come to you to talk about their experiences?
Yeah, basically, most of my best friends are bipolar because for the last 28 years as a spoken word storyteller at poetry readings and poetry slams and poetry, uh, storytelling festivals, whenever I perform or tell my stories or poems,
Hmm.
people invariably come up from the audience and says, "Your story is my story. I also live this condition," and they
Yeah.
and they become some of my true and most trusted friends, and I sell them chapbooks, so I give it to them most likely. And oftentimes I do my life as a mental health worker. I do advocacy and activism
Hmm.
outside of my day job.
Right.
So I share resources, workbooks, how to navigate the system, steer them away from the pitfalls, the rocky cliffs, the rocks, to stay away from the shores and stuff like that.
What's the
Just
shores? What does that mean? The rocks and the shores?
kind of like a ship steering through a channel, and there's like rocks ahead, and you're just
Hmm.
steering away from the rocks so you can avoid the pitfalls of the mental health system.
Ah, okay. So that I wasn't sure whether you were talking about the mental health condition or the mental health system. The mental health system is really um, problematic. It really, I often think that when you have a mental health condition, as you call it, people often think that you can't speak for yourself, that the only person who can speak for you or define what's true for you is a mental health professional. And so we don't even have a voice most of the time about the things that are going on in our lives. And even the people around us can sometimes, and with all good intentions, say, well, maybe we should talk to your psychiatrist or your psychologist about what's really going on here, rather than listening to the mental health consumer about what's true for them. Do you find that other mental health consumers that you work with are also experiencing difficulties with police when they have interactions with police, that there's a sort of a sort of a quick jump to let's control and detain and manage this person?
Oh yeah, we've had situations even at work about that. I mean, I can't talk about details because it's
No.
confidential, but sometimes the way police treat people with mental health challenges is pretty, they go from 0 to 1,000 kilometers an hour at the blink of an eye.
Yeah.
But
Instant.
just to give an example, this morning I had a Zoom meeting with a friend of mine whose family member has recently been diagnosed, and she was asking for advice and tips and stuff like that. And I was sharing resources with her, and I really am happy when people, this was a connection that reached out to me through Facebook because of the posts that I've been making.
Hmm.
She said, "Can you help me?" And I said, "I'll be happy." And I said, so I pointed in a way of different resources and try to give advice. Um, this person's family member is quite young, in her teens,
Hmm.
and I like to. I think early intervention is really important
Yep.
because this person was still employed at two jobs, and I said, I really hope that she doesn't become quote unquote institutionalized and becomes a ward of the state.
Mm.
There are pros and cons of being on disability benefits,
Right.
and it's great. It's people can subsist on it, and it really helps. But sometimes it takes away one's drive and incentive to do
Hmm.
something with one's life. When I was diagnosed bipolar, my psychiatrist, said, "You want to hear the good news or the bad news? The bad news is you have an incurable illness that will last your entire life." And it sounded like receiving a life sentence of no parole in prison.
Right.
So what's the good news is you won't have to work for the rest of your life. That was the good news.
Wow.
I never
That's not good
considered
news.
I had never considered not working,
Yeah.
an option.
Yeah.
And even years later, a later psychiatrist says most bipolars never work for the rest of their lives. You just
Wow.
become wards of the state, burdens on the society. It's the way
Yeah.
he depicted me and my contemporaries.
And that's got to kill something inside you to hear that. Like there's no hope in that, right? There's just like, I don't know, what do you do with that? Go, if you believe what that person has just said to you, then you're bound to just sort of go home and sit on the couch,
Mhm.
right? I mean, clearly you have not done that, but I mean, if a psychiatrist is telling you that you can never work, then most people in this society believe that if a psychiatrist says that, it must be true. Have you, what do you tell folks about, say, police brutality when they're dealing with bipolar or other things that might impede their ability to continue? I want to say pretend to be normal, but I just find that so often with mental health issues and folks who are dealing with conditions is that they're primed to try and be as normal or whatever they perceive as being normal, not just for psychiatrists and professionals, but other people, that their neurodiversity, whatever package that comes in, has to be pushed aside, and you have to take on this persona of normalcy. And um, so
Well, my
you,
advice for somebody who is witnessing or is in a situation with somebody, a loved one, a family member, or
mhm,
even a stranger on the street who is experiencing a mental health breakdown or mental health crisis, is to not call
mhm.
the usual emergency police, but to call car 87, request for car 87, which is the mental health police, which includes a nurse and a police officer, and they come in an ambulance as opposed to police cars.
Yes,
And they
which
will be more compassionate, more empathetic, and they know how to handle those situations better than a conventional police officer or police officers.
Car 87 actually exists in Vancouver. I don't think it exists outside of the Vancouver city. I'm not sure about that, but we're also a radio program that is listened to worldwide. And so people would need to sort of do a little research and find if they do have an option of phoning something that is like car 87, where you have a police officer and a social worker or a mental health person that comes and deals with situations that have to do with folks who are having a mental health crisis. So it would be so much better. And so it just, anyway, I don't want to get too far into that. We do need to stop and take a little bit of break. And, but don't go away, because I want to sit down a little bit longer with Kagan, virtually, of course, and talk about his films and his books and his upcoming and his play. You have a play being developed too. So I want to
Yep.
talk about that. So don't go away, folks. We'll be right back. Hey, this is Bernadine Fox, your host for Rethreading Madness, the show that dares to change how we think about mental health. If you're enjoying this podcast, don't miss out on the next episode. Make sure you subscribe.
I've never been further.
We're in our last segment of talking with Kagan about his life living with bipolar and his work as a mental health advocate. But we want to talk, and though we've touched on it a little bit, I want to talk more about his creative work, because he does have some really sort of incredible things on the go. And you heard him talk about how, people with mental health conditions may end up having some extreme forms of creativity that they're incredible at. And Gagan is one of those people. So you have a book out called Surviving Samsara. I'm not saying that right. How do you say that?
Surviving Samsara,
Samsara.
SAMSARA. Samsara is the opposite of nirvana. If there was a hell in Buddhism, samsara would be it.
Ah,
Known
okay.
as the unending chain of death, rebirth, and suffering. So I use that as a metaphor for the highs of mania, the terrors of psychosis, and the lows of depression on the roller coaster ride of the undulating seas of samsara.
Mm-hmm.
And it's basically a memoir of breakdowns, breakthroughs, and mental illness.
Mm-hmm.
The original logline was a manic depressive man struggles to discern the difference between the mental health breakdowns and spiritual breakthroughs. And it's a memoir, and yeah, it encapsulates a 28-year journey of recovery from mental illness, and it took me 28 years of blood, sweat, and tears in writing this book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it sounds like it's a very personal memoir, and memoirs, I know, are hard to write. You have to decide on every page how far into your reality are you willing to share with the world, and sometimes those decisions are hard. And what would people get out of reading your memoir?
I think, well, if I was to sum up what the book is about, it's, when I encountered the stigma of mental illness, I turned the hate inwards and became self-hate.
Mm.
And, you go through denial, you go through bargaining, you go eventually, hopefully, towards acceptance. And it's a journey towards unconditional self-love at the end.
Mm.
So there's a positive message, but it's not the usual trope of, oh, I'm suffering, and then I'm a rehabilitated, obedient, compliant mental patient.
Yes.
It is critical of the psychiatric system without being psychiatric.
Mm-hmm.
It offers alternative approaches at the end.
Right.
And I think it will really give a reader an insight into what somebody's lived experience of bipolar manic depression is. Especially, it gives a real insider's insight into the lived experience of madness, in such a way that you can actually understand it and grok it, as I would call it.
In what ways are you critical of the psychiatric system when it comes to bipolar? What do they do that is, in your view, is not okay?
I think sometimes not listening or taking the patient seriously, their concerns, such as being over-medicated to the point of what I would call a chemical straitjacket or chemical lobotomy, where you're sleeping 14 to 16 to 20 hours a day.
Right.
That is simply unacceptable, to sleep your life away.
Yeah.
Weight gain of over 120 pounds.
Wow.
In 2 or 3 months, of being on a new medication, that's simply unacceptable. And, oftentimes those pleas for help or to do something are ignored, So I'm against unsympathetic and uncompassionate doctors and psychiatrists who do not listen to the concerns of or take it seriously, or just simply ignore it.
Well, and that comes down to the whole thing of, they've gone through years of training, they've paid all this money to be the expert, and that mental health consumers can't define for themselves what is real for themselves. The psychiatrist has to do it. So that lends itself to not listening to the person in front of you. One of the other things that you talked about before when we talked was that this book is not trauma porn. And I really love that term. I wrote a memoir about being sexually assaulted as an adult by a therapist. And when I put it into the Amazon, it was an ebook, I put it into Amazon and all that stuff, the term sexual abuse automatically translated into erotic porn.
Oh my God.
And that was just a standard. that just happens. If you write sexual abuse, it puts it into a category of erotic porn. And so the idea of trauma porn is an interesting one to me. And it is true that there is this idea that that when we think of mental health or even trauma survivors or anything like that, we're focused on the trauma and we're focused on the problems and not focused on the solutions and the positive parts of it. And so I appreciate you for that.
I do offer. I'm not the voice of reason, but I do offer some advice to consumer survivors and their families and their loved ones, as well as psychiatrists and nurses and doctors. At the end of the book, I don't just complain. I offer alternative options.
Well, that's a good reason.
Just to plug the online book launch. I'll be having a conversation with author Jody Lundgren, who wrote a seminal book called Touch, which really influenced me back in the 90s. The online book launch is on Sunday, November the 7th, 7 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. For details, check out the following link: bit.ly /samsara, all lowercase, SAMSARA-launch.
I'm going to ask you to send me that link directly so that I can put it on our website for folks to actually be able to find it. And also with the promotion of this program where I on social media. So make sure you send it to me. You also, we've talked about your film, The Day the Cat Saved My Life, and that is going to be on the Mental Wellness Festival. November 1st?
It's called Mental Filmness Festival.
Mental Wellness Festival. I thought
not mental wellness, mental filmness.
Oh, okay, I get it.
Mental
Filmness Festival. And that's November 1st, and they can watch it online for free?
No, it's on currently. It started on the 9th of October, and it's running until the 1st of November.
Oh, okay. All right, thanks for clarifying.
It's available for free. You can look up Mental Filmness Film Festival 2021.
Okay. All right, so Mental Film Festival.
Mental Filmness, FILMNESS.
Festival. Online. Okay. All right. So I hope folks go and look at that, because that's the one that talks about the psychotic episode that brought you to the brink of suicide, and your cat saved your life. And I, being a cat person, I totally understand how that's possible. Also, you have recently been given a BC Arts Council grant to help make your next film called Common Law. And that is about talking about your story about how getting persons with disability a pension had caused you to actually lose your common law relationship. So we'll be looking for that in the future. But you also have a play that is being developed called...
It's also called Surviving Samsara.
Right.
It draws content from it, but it's not an adaptation. It's an entity unto itself. It's been in development since 2014, and I'm working with artistic director Susanna Uchatias from Theatre Terrific,
right?
Canada's longest running inclusive theatre company, as well as Cine Evolution Media Arts Society, which is a feminist-based immigrant-run film collective based in Richmond, and it's being co-produced by Cine Evolution and Theatre Terrific.
And you describe this as a totally sensory experience, that what you're going to be putting on stage is allowing the audience to enter your experience of bipolar.
Yeah, it's a multidisciplinary multimedia experience. It's going to be co-starring Jay Hirabayashi, the founder of Kokoro Dance, a Buto dance choreographer.
Right.
It's going to represent the id or psyche of my alter ego of the manic, psychotic, and depressive episodes. Kind of like Edward Monk's The Scream. If you know anything about Buto, they are kind of almost naked with white body paint. it's like very dramatic body
Right.
movements and facial expressions.
Cool.
So it's going to be two of us on the stage with audio visuals, kind of surround sound, almost creating like a roller coaster ride of what it's like to be in a manic, psychotic, and depressive episode.
Mhm. That's very cool. And also, you have a project on the go called Gifts of Madness, which is a documentary series for TV, I'm assuming. Am I right?
Yep.
Yeah.
It's in the very early inception stages, seedling stages of development.
Right.
I'm collaborating with an incredible mental health advocate and activist named Emily Olson. She's going to be co-directing and co-producing the project with me.
Hmm.
She created this project called the Connection Project. Look that up online, the Connection Project. She's done
Mhm.
it on 4 consecutive years since 2018. She just completed the most recent one in 2021. And she's going to be co-producing, co-directing it.
Cool.
And essentially the idea is to take 8 mad artists who use their art to heal themselves and educate the public about mental health issues and help fight the stigma, prejudice, and discrimination against the mentally ill.
Hmm. Well, I can't wait to see that develop. We have to stop, Kagan.
Okay.
Can't believe it. I can't believe it's been an entire hour. But do us a favor, and as all of these things are happening, please send me links so that I can send them out to my social media platforms and to my audience, because I'm absolutely sure that they will be interested in watching and keeping up with what you're doing. So thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Bernadine. It's been a pleasure and an honor.
Thank you. It's always an honor for me to chat with you. I find you very introspective and able to educate in a way few people do. So thank you. Thank you very much. I'm Bernadine Fox, and I just had the wonderful opportunity to speak with Kagan Goh, who is an indomitable spirit and has such a tenacity for his work around mental health conditions. Thank you, Kagan, for chatting with us. I hope you enjoyed our show today, and we thank you for joining us. Stay safe out there. I'm Bernadine Fox, and you've just listened to Rethreading Madness, the podcast that dares to change how we think about mental health. We air live on Vancouver Co-op Radio, CFRO 100.5 FM, every Tuesday at 5 p.m. or online at coopradio.org. If you have questions or feedback about this program or want to share your story or have something to say to us, we want to hear from you. You can reach us by email, rethreadingmadness@coopradio.org. If you enjoyed this show, subscribe so you don't miss the next episode.
I've never been further from knowing what the hell I'm gonna do when I can't seem to find my way under or over or through. Just when I'm ready to give up the fight, there you are when we turn out the lights, and it's alright, it's alright, don't you worry, it'll be alright. Why do I always believe it when you tell me everything's gonna be alright? Yeah. Why don't I wonder how you know? Well, surely you don't have all of the facts. You could be just making it up. Why don't I ever think of that? It's some kind of magic in the words that you breathe, saying, baby, take it from me. It's alright, it's alright, don't you worry, it'll be alright. Why do I always believe it when you tell me cliche, just words people say to be nice. Or some